Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning into our presentation today, a conversation about accessible housing and home ownership. We are going to get started with our program promptly, but we'll wait just a few more minutes to let some more audience members log in.
Patrick, in the meantime, can I remind everyone that it's National Golden Retriever Appreciation Day?
I did not know that, Dan.
Not just any retriever, but golden retrievers.
Yes, exactly. My dog wanted me to mention that, and he'll probably saunder over in a few moments and make an appearance in celebration of National Golden Retriever Day. The irony of this day is that it follows Groundhog Day, and that yesterday he was diligently looking for groundhogs, or so it appeared at the park. And I told him tomorrow is National Golden Retriever Day, and I was really hoping that he would wake up in a Groundhog Day loop like Bill Murray and say, it'll never be Golden Retriever Day, because every day he was going to go back to Groundhog Day, but that didn't happen.
We got a question real quick. Is there text for voice on the seminar, please?
So as the host, Patrick, you should be able to turn on captioning.
All right.
And wouldn't that be ironic if we did not do that, Stephen?
Yeah.
Mary, the question will be hopefully answered very soon, and I will work on getting that set up. If I don't do it right at this moment, I will make sure to do it right after the introduction is done. Speaking of which, we have a core group of people on as our audience, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. So good afternoon to everyone tuning in today. We are pleased to welcome San Francisco Association of Realtor members, Bridge Association of Realtor members from across the Bay, and public viewers invited by our guests. Our conversation today is between Realtor podcast host and accessible housing advocate, Mr. Stephen Beard, and SFAR past president, Dan Hershkowitz, on the intersection of accessibility and real estate. My name is Patrick Gardner, and I'm a loan officer with Guarantee Mortgage and chair of the Education and Events Committee at SFAR. Co-sponsoring our event today is our newest committee at SFAR, our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. On behalf of our committees, I'd like to welcome you to our Zoom call today. As we get started with the webinar, I want to share some logistics for our meeting today. All Zoom audience viewers are on mute throughout the entirety of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to view in the SFAR social video library on YouTube at the start of next week. For today's presentation, we are planning to have the tail end of the conversation be a dialogue of questions and answers with the viewers and the hosts. If you have questions, please ask all questions through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen marked Q&A. We will not be monitoring the chat feature during the presentation, but we'll be answering the questions asked through the Q&A box as we move through the latter part of the presentation. Now we turn to a little background about the gentleman we have in conversation today. First, we will start with Stephen Beard. Stephen has been a realtor, accessibility specialist, and disability advocate in the East Bay since 2004. Last year, Stephen launched a podcast about accessible housing called Accessible Housing Matters. The weekly interview show features disability advocates and influencers who are passionate about inclusion and improving housing accessibility. Stephen serves on the board of directors and the development committee of East Bay Innovations, a nonprofit dedicated to empowering people with developmental disabilities and supported housing and employment opportunities. He is also a member of the Alameda County Developmental Disabilities Planning and Advisory Council. Stephen's professional experience includes real estate sales, journalism, software product marketing, and project management. He holds 2 bachelor degrees, one in business administration and the other in journalism. He was born in Toronto, Canada, but has lived in the East Bay Area region since 2000. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Our second panelist needs no introduction to SFAR members, but those unfamiliar with our most recent past president, here's a little background. Dan Hershkowitz is a real estate broker and real estate attorney with 20 continuous years in the business. He currently serves as the Director of Risk Management for Compass, Northern California, and previously served as the broker of record and managing broker at Vanguard Properties. Dan is active in the real estate community, serving as the past president of the board of directors of the San Francisco Association of Realtors. Dan has been instrumental in drafting and revising the many local and California transaction forms. He's a past chairman of both the local SFAR Forms Committee and also the CAR Forms Committee. Dan has a wife, a golden retriever, and most importantly, he loves donuts. Welcome, Dan. And with that, I'm going
Really
to go ahead
to be here.
I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you.
All right. Stephen, I'm thrilled that we're finally doing this. Stephen and I did have an opportunity to speak last week, but I wanted to keep our conversation short so that it would be fresh today. Stephen and I have been trading some emails, and one of the things I've had the opportunity to do was to listen to and also read the transcripts of, and thank you very much for having the transcripts of Stephen's podcast. And I have been learning and learning, and I have a million questions. So I'm looking forward to today, and I'm hoping that as part of this, we can talk and unpack some of these issues like, what are the legal requirements here? Are there any legal requirements? Does the ADA even apply to residential 1 to 4? Are there any requirements to modify? What does it mean to make a reasonable accommodation? How does this tie into fair housing, right? All of that jargon. So I'm excited. Stephen, get us going, please.
So there are a lot of high-level concepts, those and others that I want to touch on. And we'll just start a dialogue and we'll see where it takes us. I want to make sure we talk about what is accessibility. And it is much bigger than some people think it is. I want to talk about what kind of challenges our clients and people in our service area face around housing when they're dealing with accessibility challenges. I want to talk about how homeownership is an option for them and how their public benefits impact their ability to be homeowners. A lot of us make the mistaken assumption that just because someone is on benefits or on Section 8, that they are not anyway ever going to be able to own a home. I want to talk about the issues that you mentioned as well. And so we're going to dive right in. So I think it's really important to take a really broad view of what accessibility is all about. And it is not just about mobility. It is also about transportation. It's about community. It's about the way people want to live in their living space that allows them to have the maximum amount of independence. And one of the challenges that happens is that you look at a person who has an obvious physical challenge, and the tendency is to make an assumption that they're just like everybody else who has an obvious physical challenge. So that's really important for people to be aware of. We want to come from a space of curiosity when we're encountering clients who are differently abled.
Is there a big however there? And let me just go back. Sometimes, for those of us who haven't had challenges, and I am grateful that I haven't, we take for granted and we forget, right? And so one of the things that I've enjoyed about listening to your podcast is a reminder that, yeah, it isn't just physical challenges, right? There are a lot of other challenges and even some associated with that. So let's say the house itself, and I know we're going to get into some of this, but let's say the house itself is made accessible for me, right? But that doesn't mean it's accessible for my visitors, right? And so we talk about who's going to come to this house. Or maybe the house itself is accessible to me, but how do I get to the house and in and out of the house when it's on a steep hill and there's public transportation at the bottom of that hill, for instance?
Yeah,
right?
And it even gets bigger than that. Let's suppose you have a home that works for you because of your physical limitation with ramping or whatever, and you make friends, you become friends with your next door neighbor, but you can never go to their house because it was not modified in any way.
Right. And the disappointment here is that, and we'll talk about building code in a little while, is that there isn't much of an emphasis on making real change and considering retrofit in a bigger context. And I think there's some misnomers there. But let's take a little bit of a look now, I think, at this slide and some of the different challenges. So we don't just have, with some people, it isn't just a physical challenge, but I think what's helpful here is that, your cartoon characters here, I think, are intended to include, for instance, people that are aging and some of the challenges of aging. And I can just give an example if I could. I've been splitting time between here and Washington. We moved my parents from Florida to Washington State, where my mother has been very ill. And after she got out of the hospital and was able to come home, we had to set up the house to work for her, right? And as an incredible irony or stroke of luck or serendipity, I was literally at the hardware store looking to buy things like grab bars and things to make her life better. And there was an author there who was selling her book on what people need in their home in aging. And she was reminding me of some of these items. And she reminded me that as someone is challenged as they get older, for instance, as they're getting Alzheimer and those kind of cognitive issues, clutter is a terrible foe for them and is very disorienting, as are intense colors. And we talked about that. And we talked about how important lighting is, and that when it gets drastically dark, how disorientating that is. And then, of course, we talked about trip hazards and other things, but it was very interesting how there's a whole panoply and range. And so I guess what we need to be aware of as realtors is not only to appreciate this range, but how can we service our clients, right? And how can we take advantage of this new knowledge that you're going to help us with to broaden our horizon and get more clients, for that matter. So I'd love to hear you talk about your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot more to serving the clients in this community than simply finding a house that works for them for whatever their need is. And one of the things is knowing the resources that are going to help them to live most independently in that home. I interviewed a wonderful lady from my podcast last fall who is an interior design specialist, and she can go into a kitchen or a bathroom and size up its weaknesses from an accessibility point of view for someone with limited mobility in an instant. And and there are lots of very, very inexpensive things you can do, and other things you can do with remodels that just make a space, an existing space, better for folks, so they don't have to necessarily spend tens of thousands of dollars on a remodel. What I'd like to do is go to the next slide, if I can get it to forward. And I just want to give everyone listening some idea of the language of accessibility and clarify a few things that confuse realtors. The first is this term universal design. And the basic way to understand it, it's an architectural idea that living spaces are designed for use by anyone, regardless of their whether they self-identify, whether they as a person with a disability or whether they're not. The idea that we should be building spaces that are maximally accessible for the vast majority of people. So that's the concept of universal design, and I am thrilled to be doing an episode of my podcast very soon about new accessible design standards that the community hopes will one day be as famous as LEED standards for environmental environmental standards in architecture. Then there's the concept of visitability. And that means someone can come visit the house who has a mobility challenge. Typically homes with at least one bedroom and bathroom on a pathway with no barriers or thresholds. So we see a new development in California anyway. I've seen new development where the developer's doing dozens or hundreds of units, and there is a model or two of the 4 or 5 or 6 different models of the development that has a visitability component. But the vast majority of the homes in the development don't have that. Some counties and cities around the state have actually passed visitability ordinances for new multi-unit housing, and that's good.
And so the idea there is that you could, for instance, have a 2-floor house and we don't have accessibility to the second floor where we do have some bedrooms, etc. But the first floor, the ground level, is made such that it is usable by, and I don't know if there are quote unquote typical disabilities, but what we think of as typical physical challenges.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is not the best. It is not, you know, what disability advocates would like to see as the ideal solution, but it is a start. And it is a term that is in common parlance inside the disability world, especially in this context. What I want to spend time on with this group is talk about ADA compliant. I want to warn us all to be very cautious about using the term ADA compliant. At the highest level, ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act does not directly talk about residential spaces at all. It doesn't. It's about commercial, government, public spaces, but not about residential spaces, not directly.
Let's just stop there for a moment. Boom, right? A bunch of heads just exploded, I promise you, right?
Right.
ADA compliance and the ADA, Americans with Disability Act, is not interested in residential 1 to 4. Just isn't.
Not directly.
Right.
But I have to give you a couple,
right.
I have to give you a couple of caveats. The first thing is a warning. Never, ever in your confidential remarks or your public remarks refer to the property as being ADA compliant, because it's a meaningless thing to say and it's misleading. So that's just my warning for everyone. But
what is the good jargon?
There isn't anything great. I like to say for that the property is disability friendly, accessibility friendly, wheelchair.
How about includes accessibility components?
Features, yeah, includes accessibility features. You can be very specific, has roll-in shower, right? Yep. So we have to be careful about the way we describe properties that might have a wheelchair ramp. But the other thing I want to say about the ADA is that although what I said was completely true, the ADA does have a sort of a component where it has enforcement over residential spaces that have government funding. Mm-hmm. So there is an element of multi-unit construction that gets federal government money that then comes under the auspices of having to meet the standards in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it doesn't affect most of us in residential 1 to 4, but it is the way that it touches housing directly.
And so an example there would be public housing and multi-unit public apartment housing, or multi-unit apartment housing typically that's built with government subsidy.
Exactly.
But very rarely touched, therefore, by anything that's sold on the open market, unless I guess these homes were later converted and sold by the local government as condos.
Well, there is a component of the market here in the East Bay for below market rate housing, where the city has entered into a deal to have the building built and to set aside some units they're going to sell at a discount. And those buildings may have had ADA, may have had government funding, which meant that they were built to the standard in the ADA.
Let me ask you this question, because this is often very disappointing, is often when we have these set-asides where there's going to be money set aside for below market rate, et cetera, often what we see is different standards in building. And so I'm curious about what you just described. Do we sometimes have government-assisted buildings that have 5 units that are ADA compliant, but 25 that are not? Or when we have the money put into it, are they all required to be?
So that's a great question. The common areas would have to meet a standard, not all of the residences within them, as I understand it. Now, I'm not a developer. Sure. There are some excellent people doing work in that space, but my understanding is that it's the ADA rules have to do with the common areas within the multi-unit structure that is getting federal subsidy money, not the units themselves beyond those specific units that are being designed for that purpose. Yeah.
What about the next obvious extension here, which is building codes which changed, right?
Yes.
Being made more friendly to this concept. And I have to say that I listened to a podcast the other day on feng shui, and and obviously I've had you on my mind for the last several weeks, right? I've been listening to your podcasts, etc. But I kept thinking to myself, so many of these feng shui concepts could easily merge with this discussion today, because what is a more palatable space to us, right? In terms of what feels right, and they can work together. And what that made me think was, if we do put this into the building code, people are going to find that, one, it actually is a more accommodating space for everyone, right? And that it feels right,
So once we get away from the ADA and we're talking about building, there are laws that for multi-unit housing around the issue of being disability friendly, being accessible. There's fair housing laws and California building code, and some cities like San Francisco overlays on top of that. It gets incredibly detailed, and the good news is, from my perspective, that the California standard, the California building code, and the California overlay on fair housing law, they all have more rigorous standards for compliance with accessibility parameters than do the standard fair housing law and building codes in many, many, many other jurisdictions.
You know what I'm looking at right now? I have on my other screen, I have the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory that CAR created last year, that is now bundled with all of our purchase agreements and lease agreements. And just looking at the protected classes and characteristics, obviously it started years ago with race, color, religion, and ancestry, and national origin, and it moved on. And now there are two that are interesting here: disability, and it says parenthetically mental and physical, but there's also another one which is medical condition, right? And it's interesting, right? And then as a reminder, who's required to comply with the fair housing? Sellers, real estate licensees, mobile home parks, insurance companies, landlords, right? But what is also disappointing is that I think what we found is that the case law has told us that the reasonable accommodations that need to be made do not yet include, for instance, a landlord having to put in a ramp for a tenant. But the tenant has the right to do that themselves at their expense.
That's right. Reasonable accommodation laws are relatively weak, in my opinion. If a tenant needs something for able to live safely, would qualify as a reasonable accommodation, they can put it in their own expense, and they have to take it out at their own expense. The landlord is not obligated to have it stay there when the tenant leaves.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's even true with, I think, grab bars, etc.
Yeah. There are it is a limited right for people who are renting property if the property does not already have the accessibility needs that they need to live in.
So what have you seen in terms of building code changes that are in the positive?
Well, California building code has evolved a lot in the past 20 years to include all kinds of standards around accessibility in spaces. And I'm not just talking about thresholds, but also widths of hallways and turning ratio space in hallways and in bathrooms and in kitchens, and a lot of other detail about how you do kitchen cabinetry, and how you do roll-in showers and other types of spaces that people need who may have a challenge. But I do want to point out that some of these building code options are optional. Not all the building code is you must do this. So a lot of the building code is, if you are going to do X, then you have to do it to Y standard, right? And I think that that would be that has to be kept in context. What is required versus what is optional. And different cities have gone to different lengths around this. Like the city of Alameda has put into place a multi-unit universal design ordinance a few years back, which is a model. I think they're the only city in the Bay Area that's done it. And that impacts anyone building new housing in Alameda. Overlay on top of California Building Code and going beyond fair housing law requirement for building and construction.
Well, a little shout out to the people on the island of Alameda.
Yeah. So if it's okay, Daniel, I want to talk a little bit about, for us as realtors, about how they can serve these clients.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
And I also want to hear your experience on how you've made a living servicing these clients.
Well, you know, I've been doing real estate 17 and a half years, and you know, not all my clients are folks that are dealing with physical or non-physical challenges, but it's been my entire marketing approach, and I'm somewhat of a unicorn. In my research, there's probably less than a handful of agents around the country who choose to market themselves this way. And the way I built this, for all you newer agents out there, it was on the ground networking, and getting to know people in the disability community that allowed me to build my network and build my sphere of influence. Because I was a relative newcomer to the United States when I started in real estate here. And I didn't have this huge built-in network. So yeah. Anyway.
Well, I want to say that, first of all, I applaud you. And it's a cool niche, right?
Thank you.
Of all the niches out there, right? You could have had a niche of working for terrible people, but you have chosen something else. And one of your podcasts had that really interesting gentleman from the Seattle area.
Yeah, who is like me, serving this client group. Yes.
Right. And he, you know, that is, and I forgot his website address, but it is all, you know, it's like, you know, disabilityrealtor.com kind of thing. You know, I mean, it is about it. And there's a ton of information on his site. And he was instrumental in getting the MLS, and there's one big MLS that serves all of Washington, apparently, to have some great accessibility features. And we'll see that we have some of those also, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But he also went further to say, okay, if you're going to advertise on the MLS that you have these accessibility features, there's actually a provision that requires or allows for the MLS to check to see if this is correct, to the extent that you say. And what he shared with me, which I thought was really interesting and also disappointing, was that there was a perception from a lot of realtors that to advertise and market that the property had accessibility features would drive its price down. And he said, are you crazy? There's a whole bunch of people who want this as an option for them, and we're going to feature it, and it's going to drive the price up. And that has been his experience. And he had a whole niche of taking expired listings that didn't feature these things and then featuring them and selling them quickly.
Yeah, it's there is a growing awareness where we properly describe, well, there's two issues going on. Number one is properly describing the features of a home such that people can understand what they're reading. But the other thing is understanding that we have an aging society, and sometimes aging in place isn't an option. And I was going to sort of talk about some of the housing issues involved here. And so since aging in place isn't an option, we need to be able to describe properties in a way that, you know, let's suppose you or your client are able and are not dealing with any of these issues, but they have a family member who may be living with them, for whom it's going to be an issue either immediately or in the future. You know, we want to be able to support them. And, you know, our MLSs in our area, I was going to talk about that a little later, but they let us down in the sense that there's no consistency across the different Bay Area MLSs around how to describe different things that are accessible features, nor is there any verification process. And what happens is many agents who are less informed will optionally choose not even to mention that the home has a wheelchair ramp or that it has a roll under kitchen sink or bathroom sink or something, because they believe that it will hurt the value of the sale.
Which
and
is
listing
crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of listing agents who, if they see a ramp that is visible from the street, no matter how pretty it is, they're going to feel that that's going to limit their ability to market and sell the property. And that's a problem because there are no laws or rules that require people to make homes accessible, single families, and there's no laws for homes to stay that way when they're sold. And I respect private property ownership rights, but as a result, when I'm working with my clients, the pool of properties that can meet their needs available immediately in this area of the world is extremely limited. So not only do my clients have to have a budget to buy a home, they also need to have a budget to modify the home to make it work, because 95% of the single family homes in our built up older areas of the East Bay and the city, the homes just were never, no one gave any thought to that when these homes were built.
Let me throw something out there. We joke that there's only two things realtors want: money and less paperwork, right? And let's just play to that for a moment. If you're looking for money and more opportunities, well, here is one. There is this whole huge group of people who are retiring, and now with Proposition 19 are more likely to move because they can take their tax basis with them, right? And so wouldn't it be helpful if you had a listing to think, when you're talking about spending some concierge dollars to make this listing more attractive to a larger pool of buyers, why not include this pool of buyers? And I personally know of several instances in which somebody with a disability who needed, for instance, a big open one floor property in San Francisco, and there are very few, quote unquote, were overpaid, and happily so, right? Because these properties had what they needed and it didn't require much of a conversion. And so
over and over again, that happens with my buyers.
Right. And so I'll give you an example. I served as a commissioner on the Assessment Appeals Board for years, and someone came in to appeal their base assessment. They bought a house for $1.6 million, 15 years ago, near Lake Merced, and it was a huge one-story ranch. And the gentleman was in a wheelchair, and he explained that there were 4 listings that worked for him at that time, 4 in the whole city. And he overpaid by what he thought was $250,000 because he needed to get this house. And I'm happy to say that we adjusted his base accordingly. But I think that's a lesson that, listen, there is this niche out here. If you want to put concierge dollars into something, this might be something to consider for your client.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue that we have to get over this notion that just because someone is in a wheelchair or someone has a cognitive challenge, that they are either incapable of making decisions for themselves, or more seriously, that they have no money. There is this idea out there of, quite unfairly, that everyone you see who, this is an assumption we make, they must be poor and impoverished, and really we should pity them because they don't have what we have, right? And so that kind of stereotyping is also why I'm so unique, why this isn't more just part of the normal real estate, milieu, right?
Right. And if today goes well, we just put competition against you, right?
That's all right. I think the more the merrier.
Let me focus for just a moment on the MLS and the features that we do have. So I think you're right to criticize. The good news is, as the past president of our MLS, I've already started a discussion with our MLS about what our features are and trying to better sync them with our super regional, right? And you were part of that conversation, and that conversation will continue. And I must say that the people at our MLS are very woke people and are interested in making this right, okay? So there's really will be an effort, and there has been. Let me tell you what we have currently, because you can, as a listing agent, make sure that you are advertising your property as same, and there are fields in our MLS, and these fields are also searchable, right? So when you're representing a buyer, you can limit your searches, including these accessibility fields. And so I'm looking at a screenshot, and the caption is accessibility features, right? So that's already a field all by itself. And then within that, I see 6 entries in front of me here. Let's see, accessible approach with ramp, accessible elevator installed, accessible kitchen, grab bars, lowered switches, and that's a reference to light switches, right? Roll-in shower, wheelchair access, quote, see remarks. And the see remarks there is, so when you're searching for accessible features, and you may or may not have one of these in particular, but you want to capture people who are looking for accessible features, you can check the see remarks and then you can type. And so when someone is searching and they're only going to include properties that include accessible features, this property will come up, right? And I think that's important.
Yeah, and it's getting better. And the issue that I'm concerned with is verification. I know that in Washington State, where they have this one universal MLS, there is a process for verifying through the MLS that the data checkpoints that have been completed are true to some standard that has been defined. And I think it would be great if we could establish across the Bay Area a standard for what it means to say you've got a ramp or a wheel or a roll-in shower, or like our MLS in the East Bay has a category that says bathroom modifications for accessibility, which is, you know, meaningless. What the heck is that? Is it grab bars? Is it a roll-in shower? Is it countertops that are low at different levels? Is it lower switches? I mean, so I think there's still a lot of work we can do to do a really better job with the MLS, and I'm really glad to see what's going on in around that right now in San Francisco.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was talking about, let me just go back quickly. I was going, if I can get it to go back. Why doesn't it want to go back? So I wanted to give some context for people watching that we have a housing problem for people with disabilities around what to do. And there are 4 solutions for housing. So when you meet with folks and you're doing a consultation, you want to make sure you've looked at their entire circumstance, because the bigger thing is to help people with their housing, not necessarily first and foremost to sell them a house. If you do a good job of listening to them and be an advisor to them around housing, whether they buy a house now or buy a house later, they're always going to remember how helpful you were, and they're going to come back to you. And so aging in place is absolutely worth exploring before we rush to put their home on the market and tell them they can't live in there anymore. For some families, arranging for supported living, where someone comes into the home, may be all that's needed. Moving to a rental property and moving to a new own property are the other 2 broad categories. And we are challenged by, of course, everybody knows about the affordable housing challenge, and we talked about already the lack of accessible housing. But the older the home and the way the homes used to be built, renovations to the house could be really expensive, especially in the city and in parts of the East Bay, where we have all these old Victorians with their really narrow hallways, and they're gorgeous. I admit, Victorians are beautiful, but they're not often particularly accessible for wheelchair users. And the expertise issue, because this is why I'm so glad to be doing this with you today, Daniel, because we have really limited expertise, not just by real estate agents, but by developers and landlords. So it's a constant education process that I'm thrilled to engage in, and another reason why I'm glad to talk to other real estate agents all the time about ways that we can be thinking about how we use property, how we live in property, how we live in communities. So,
you know, one of the many things I learned from your podcast was that, and not everybody with the same quote unquote disability are alike. And one example was simply, what kind of chair do you have, right? Do you have a motorized chair or do you have a manual chair? And they're quite different, and their size and their ability to go through doorways is quite distinct.
Right, and even 2 people using a power chair may have very, very different circumstances. And so the use of a power chair is often associated with how that person wants to get around more than any lack of ability to use their arms to manipulate a manual chair, and convenience of not having to exert the energy too. So there's a lot of things that come into play when people choose healthy living aids or technology to help them live. In the medical world, they call it durable medical equipment, right? But I do want to stress that there are no laws or rules that require any home or apartment to be accessible if it isn't already been built that way. And there are no laws that require accessible property to be sold or rented to people who need that property. And so one of the things I want everyone to understand is that if you're showing new construction, anything built in the 90s or later, it is very likely to have a minimum accessibility standard. Anyone who's been looking at condos recently and looks at a condo built in the 80s versus one built in the 90s or later notices the huge kitchens and the huge bathrooms and the big hallways. That's as a result of the new laws, the Fair Housing Law, and to the extent that it applies the ADA. Most condos, there are many condos and apartments in our areas that have been modified to be, and they're what we call mostly accessible. So let's suppose you're working with a client who doesn't use a wheelchair, but uses a cane or just needs to move around a little more slowly, and doesn't, can't really, and steps aren't going to work for them. They may be able to buy a condo that has, few or zero thresholds, even if the bathroom footprint is on the small side. And the other thing agents should know is that there are many, 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 many houses in the resale world that are adaptable. That is to say, we can modify them with just doing minor things, both inside and out. So I think it's important for us to be thinking about that. We've talked about the MLS. I want to share some things that you should be thinking about. If you have a client who has a physical challenge, I want to give some people some things that they should be thinking about when they serve these clients. First of all, they should be thinking not just about thresholds from the front of the house to get inside, but from wherever the street is, the car park, where you park the car, or the bus stop is, and not just to the front door, but to everywhere on the lot. One of the things that, I show some property to somebody, and yeah, they can get in the house, but the backyard is completely terraced and up a hill, so they're not going to be able to do anything with their backyard, right? Or maybe the side of the property is too narrow, so they're never going to be able to get down the side of the property. So that's something that we want to think about when we show property to clients with physical challenges. Also, I mentioned it before, turning ratios, hallway widths, and one of the things that's really infuriating is you go into a home and it's got this really huge bathroom, but you can't turn into it because the hallway's too narrow. That just drives me crazy.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Vehicle access to and from a parked accessible van. You may have an old home that has a nice ramped or a zero threshold entrance and a big enough footprint for the chair inside, but the driveway for unloading from the van is inadequate. So they're always going to be dropping the person off at the street or wherever it is. And then I'm in the city. This is obviously more challenging than where I am with the way property is right up to each other in many parts of San Francisco. And so there's
not to mention the hills. I can think of my friend's mother who's in her 90s, and she's trapped in her house because she lives on this crazy hill, and her house is adapted for her. But how the hell can she ever get in or out?
Exactly. I also want everyone to be thinking about folks that they can help or their families who have cognitive challenges. I'm thinking of people with on the autism spectrum with Down syndrome. Many of them do not have physical obvious difficulties. So one of the things, there's three things I want people to think about, or that I think about for my clients. One, the level of independent living skills that are going to be required for the location where the property is, right? Because different folks are going to have different skill sets, and you should be working with the family member. You will want to work with the family members and with other care professionals involved with that individual to assess this. Secondarily, many of our clients have care providers or assistants that will either live in or come daily to help them with daily living tasks. And so how suitable is the space for the care provider assistant to access and maybe live in? And then how suitable is the client for doing their own property management? Things that we teach first-time buyers and that we take it for granted as homeowners, paying the bills, fixing stuff that gets broken, cleaning up, are all things that we want to think of when we have clients who want to live independently but have other challenges that limit them. And what's really cool is there's all this new technology coming on stream right now. I've done some episodes about it, about remote services, where you can tie in technology to remind people of things like this and of other things they need to do to live independently in their own homes, which is what we're really ultimately striving for.
And part of that, may I say, and then I learned from your podcast, the obvious disability of a wheelchair, right, is very obvious, but there's so many other things, and so many of the other challenges are actually have real, what's the word, technology solutions, right? And so a smart home can really service a client, whether it's a hearing disability, a visual disability, or a whole range of different challenges.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to touch on, Daniel, before we go to questions and other angles on this, is the idea of Section 8 homeownership. I think many of the guests today will be aware of Section 8 vouchers and the ability of landlords to take tenants who are being supported by a local housing authority. And in the Bay Area, we have about 6. We have a whole bunch of housing authorities. I know San Francisco City has its own, and it's not county-based, and it's not city-based. It's a whole hodgepodge. Anyway, some of these housing authorities of HUD, some of these offices allow the Section 8 holder to transition from their voucher being good to pay a landlord rent to being applicable against a mortgage, creating a mortgage subsidy for 30 years for a person with a disability. So it's a really cool program where it exists. In the East Bay, the only community that still offers it right now is Oakland, and it has a city-based housing authority. But we have helped clients over the years actually buy homes using this program. It seems unimaginable in the very fiercely competitive market we're in right at this moment, but it is going to be important as markets change over the years, and it's very possible that other jurisdictions will want to offer this. It is a complete path out of poverty. I've been doing this, I've been selling homes in this community for 14, 15 years, and I've got people coming to me now who I helped get into homes this way, who are now selling their homes and coming off of government assistance and still having hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity in their pocket and able to restart their lives without any need for government support anymore. So it's a pathway out of poverty, quite frankly, in our area. And I just want people to be aware of it, and something we want to press the housing authorities to make more available.
I'd love to see more of that. And as a reminder to the agents, it is unlawful for your landlord clients to discriminate against Section 8 tenants. So often you'll see in the Craigslist list that the ad actually says no Section 8 vouchers. 100% unlawful.
Right, absolutely.
And I'd just like to say, even if we're looking at the worst motivations of landlords and sellers and say it's all about money, well, what do we care where the money comes from, right? Particularly with a sale. What do I care where the money comes from? If this buyer qualifies through this program, fantastic, write an offer.
Yeah.
So what do we want to do now? Do we want to open up for some questions?
I think that's a great idea.
Okay. So I know that we had some questions that I think were somewhat answered in the I'm looking now at, unfortunately, at some of the questions, and we have this terrible irony that we were unable to put on the closed captioning, and that is an obvious irony here, and I'm very sorry for that. I didn't realize that that was going to happen, and I'm happy to get together with anybody who does have questions and make other arrangements as best we can to get
Yeah,
your.
if people want to email me, I'm going to put in the chat my email address. I'm happy to share the presentation with anybody who wasn't able to appreciate all the points we were talking about, and talk to anyone about any of it too.
I appreciate that very much. Is there anybody who'd like to open up their mic and ask a question? Is that possible? Patrick, do we have that possibility?
I don't think in this format we have that option available to us. I know Alan Akamoto wanted to ask a question. He had his hand up earlier. I'll see if I can allow him to talk.
Okay.
Alan, you there? I guess we can allow speakers to talk.
Well, I now see his picture at least.
There he is.
No, I didn't have a question. I'm sorry. I must have pressed the wrong button. But you
Well,
guys are doing a fantastic job. I'm so interesting.
well, I will.
For those of you who don't know Alan, Alan is past president of everything and a wonderful mentor to us all. So thank you for being here, Alan.
No, it's an honor. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to take you off.
I want to, if no one has a question, I want to touch on one more thing, Daniel. We
Please.
live in an aging society. There are things going on in demographics that are really important to how we serve our clients around this issue of accessibility. We have a scenario where people are aging with disabilities and living longer than they ever used to before, and therefore their care needs are accentuated, and there are more people who are living with different types of physical and cognitive experiences than was true in the past. We live in and they're living longer. We also live in a society where we don't respect care providing to pay for it, what we should be paying for it. And so the world of care for people who have needs around that is small, and you can make more money working at Chipotle. And so that creates, so what's happened is families tend to care for their kids and who have these needs and circumstances in their own homes. And they themselves are aging out of the ability to support their kids. This is creating all kinds of accessibility challenges that impacts us as real estate agents. And so it isn't just this sort of a societal thing that has nothing to do with us. Because when we're meeting with families more and more, we're going to be finding out where their pain point is around this and how they need to provide housing solutions that address all of that. And I think it's important to look at a broad context of what's going on in society. And that's the negative. On the other hand, I think it's also important to point out that technology is going to be a great boon in homes of the future. And the ability to automate and remotely provide support to people will allow more and more people who would previously have had to live in a group home or, God forbid, in an institution, but certainly with a lot of, in-home support, will now be able to live independently more and more, because they will be able to, use their smart speaker and other devices to immediately get help. Oh, how many pills am I supposed to take right now? And how do I make my dinner? Can you help me through it? And, and they won't need as much, they'll be able to get more technology built, and homes are being built more and more technologically advanced all the time. So that's kind of the positive spin on it, right?
Well, even with the example that you gave of an older couple who has an adult child that is living with them because they have their challenges, that adult child with improved technology and with improved dwellings may be able to end up in a one-bedroom apartment that is, well accessible and has all of these accessibility features, automated features, pardon me, and the parents can then feel as though they can move on to their next home, right? So long it is equally wired, right? And now perhaps we have two sales, not to be selfish, right? We have the sale to put the child into his one-bedroom condo somewhere. We have the sale of the family home that they've been in for all of these years, and perhaps the third sale of where they end up that's more suitable to their needs as aging parents. Yeah. Cool. You know what? I'm tempted to declare it a success. Patrick, do you want to make
well, I've got one question for Stephen,
Please.
just real quick, because I'm curious on what advice that he would give, you know, a relatively new agent. I know when agents are talking to buyers and or sellers, they're asking, you know, just kind of an initial needs analysis. What questions are important to ask people that they may not know as an agent that you need answers to? So if I'm sitting down with an intake form for, you know, a buyer or seller, how can I, you know, position myself to look out for the needs that they may not know that they need to express to me when I'm going out and looking for a home?
First of all, thank you for that question. It's incredibly important. And I would say that as agents, it is our job to come from curiosity and not from judgment. So just because you see a person who has an obvious physical or non-physical challenge, don't make any assumptions. So you want to ask the question, how do you use your space? Or if you're talking, if they're nonverbal, how does this person use their space? Specifically, how do they get from room to room? Who helps them in the bathroom? How do they get to their place that they go to out of the home? Who helps with that? What kind of challenges do you have in your current environment around those issues? What has worked? What isn't working? What would work really well if you move to a new place around those types of things? And if you just start from that point of view, I promise you they'll tell you, and you will be really serving them at a higher level, because they will have an appreciation and you will have an appreciation of how to really give them an opportunity to change their housing in a way that will give them a long-term option, a long-term experience. And you will be looking at property through those eyes and, you know, being the true fiduciary we're supposed to be, right? That's where I would start with those questions. I mean, you can also get into questions about vehicles. You know, would you have an accessibility van? Does it load from the front or the side? You know, how do you get, you know, how do you use, you know, what kind of, you can get into real specifics about how they would use a shower stall or a bathroom, you know, and you got to be delicate about it because some people don't really want to tell you. You know, they get, when you start talking about bathrooming stuff, you know, you got to be a little sensitive to it, but it's important if you're working with a client for whom that might be different than the normal kind of place you know, the normal kind of modality you're experienced with.
You know, threading the needle there and concerns about fair housing and steering, right,
Yes.
is what isn't different in that conversation from with any client is the buyer's needs, right? So what does the buyer need and why are we doing this? And the Department of Real Estate reminds us that one of our fiduciary duties is to actually make a concerted effort to ask the buyer, what are their material issues? What do they need? And there's actually a CAR form called BMI, Buyer Material Issues. You would call it an intake sheet, right? And
yeah.
Right, and it says, listen, what isn't working in your current home, right? What would be working in your new home, and help me just to put me on the path of where to go and what to look for. And so that's important because they can tell you exactly what they want and need in this conversation without you assuming and therefore steering, right? And thinking that, hey, a disabled person must be here. That, of course, would be wrong, right? And that
Absolutely.
would probably be unlawful under the fair housing guidelines. Imagine for a moment if you said, just because Mr. Hershkowitz is Jewish, I must put him here, right? It's the same fair housing issue. But having a conversation about where they want to go and having Mr. Hershkowitz say on his own that he's interested in being near the synagogue or within 3 blocks of X, Y, and Z, and then setting you out on that path, that's a whole different story. Cool. Patrick, I think you should declare it a success.
I am declaring this event an educational opportunity for us all a great success. Thank you, members of SFAR, Bridge, and audience in general for tuning in. That concludes our workshop.
And thank you for letting me do this and let me participate with you guys. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Yeah, we want to do this
Thank
again,
you.
Stephen. We're going to have to bring you to Compass too and have you do a
I'm quite happy at KW. Thank you.
Cool. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. I meant as a guest speaker.
Oh, I see. I would love to talk to your agents. Yeah,
Great.
absolutely. Anytime.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, guys.
Everyone. We're going to stop the recording.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.